Lubang Island sits off the western edge of the Philippines, separated from the larger landmass of Luzon by a narrow stretch of water. The island is mountainous in places, with dense tropical forest rising quickly from the coast. In the mid-20th century, much of its interior was difficult to reach. Roads were limited. Villages clustered near the shoreline, while the hills remained largely undeveloped. The climate followed familiar patterns of heat, rain, and seasonal storms. Vegetation grew quickly and aggressively. Paths disappeared within weeks if they were not used. For those moving inland, visibility dropped fast. Sound carried unevenly through trees and ravines. From certain ridgelines, the ocean was visible, but the settlements below were often hidden by foliage. By late 1945, the wider world had already shifted. Global shipping lanes reopened. Governments reorganized. Cities rebuilt. On Lubang, these changes arrived slowly. The island returned to agriculture and fishing. Life resumed along established routines, shaped more by weather and harvests than by distant political events. In the forested interior, however, there were places where time did not advance so clearly. Old trenches and temporary shelters remained from the final years of the Pacific War. Equipment rusted where it had been abandoned. Paper notices left behind decayed in the rain. The land absorbed what was left. There was no single marker on the island announcing that the war had ended. No boundary line separated wartime terrain from peacetime ground. The jungle did not change its behavior in response to surrender documents or official ceremonies. It remained consistent, indifferent, and enclosing. It was within this environment, quiet, layered, and largely unchanged, that one presence persisted, unnoticed by the world beyond the island's edge. Hiro Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. He came of age during a period when military service was framed as both duty and identity. By the early 1940s, Japan was fully engaged in a global conflict, and its military doctrine emphasized endurance, obedience, and the rejection of surrender under any circumstances. Onoda was trained as an intelligence officer, not as a conventional infantryman. In late 1944, he attended the Nakano School in Tokyo, an institution known for preparing soldiers for unconventional warfare. The training focused on survival, reconnaissance, and independent operations behind enemy lines. Soldiers were taught to live off the land, gather information quietly, and maintain operational discipline even when cut off from command. Withdrawal or surrender was not part of the curriculum. In December 1944, Onoda was dispatched to Lubang Island. His assignment was specific. He was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare, disrupt enemy operations, and, most importantly, never surrender. His commanding officer made clear that no matter how long it took, Onoda was to continue his mission until directly relieved by superior orders. At the time, Lubang held strategic value. Allied forces were advancing through the Philippines, and Japanese units were retreating or being isolated across numerous islands. Communication lines were unstable. Many units operated with limited information, relying on assumptions and prior directives rather than real-time updates. Onoda arrived with several other soldiers. They carried rifles, ammunition, and minimal supplies, expecting to supplement their needs through local resources. Early defensive preparations were made in the hills. As Allied pressure increased, Japanese forces on the island fractured. Some surrendered. Others were killed. Small groups retreated inland. When the war officially ended in August 1945, announcements were broadcast and leaflets were dropped across the Philippines. On Lubang, messages reached the villages and coastal areas. For those living inland, the information was inconsistent and often filtered through uncertainty. For Onoda, whose training stressed deception as a core enemy tactic, such messages were suspect by design. Without direct confirmation from a superior officer, external information was not considered authoritative. The framework he had been given in 1944 remained intact. By the end of that year, Onoda and a shrinking number of companions had withdrawn fully into the interior of the island. Their understanding of the world was already diverging from the reality beyond the forest canopy. By late 1945, the operational situation on Lubang Island had changed decisively. Allied forces had moved on. Japanese command structures in the region were dissolved. For the island's residents, the war became a memory rather than an active condition. Fields were replanted. Homes were repaired. Trade slowly resumed with nearby ports. In the interior, signs of these changes appeared in fragments. Aircraft no longer passed overhead. Gunfire ceased. Patrols from opposing forces stopped moving through the forest. What remained were occasional encounters between villagers and the men still living in the hills, brief, tense moments marked by distance and caution. Leaflets were dropped announcing Japan's surrender. Some included photographs of Japanese officers, newspapers, and personal messages from families. Onoda and his companions examined these materials carefully. They noted inconsistencies in language, formatting, and tone. Based on their training, they concluded the materials were propaganda designed to draw them out. The group continued to operate under the assumption that the conflict persisted elsewhere, and that Lubang remained part of a broader, unresolved campaign. Supplies were rationed. Weapons were maintained. Fire discipline was observed. Movement was limited to avoid detection. Over time, the group diminished. One member surrendered in 1950. Others were killed during encounters with local authorities in subsequent years. Each loss reinforced Onoda's belief that the situation remained hostile. Survival became inseparable from the mission itself. The moment of no return was not marked by a single decision, but by accumulation. Each dismissed leaflet, each avoided contact, and each passing season reduced the possibility of reintegration. The longer the group remained isolated, the more difficult it became to accept information that contradicted their understanding. By the early 1950s, Onoda was effectively alone or accompanied only briefly. His daily life was shaped by routines established during the war, sustained without reinforcement or revision. The end of the conflict existed only as an external claim, unsupported by the authority he had been taught to trust. The separation between official history and lived experience had become complete. From the early 1950s onward, Hiro Onoda's life on Lubang Island settled into a pattern defined less by events than by repetition. The routines he followed were not improvised in desperation. They were structured, deliberate, and rooted in the training he had received before arriving on the island. Survival, in his case, was not a reaction to crisis but the continuation of an assignment. Onoda moved through the forest with restraint. He avoided creating fixed shelters that could be easily discovered, instead using temporary hideouts that could be abandoned without trace. These positions were selected based on elevation, visibility, and access to water. He favored ridgelines and dense vegetation, places where movement below could be observed without direct exposure. Food acquisition followed a consistent system. Onoda gathered wild bananas, coconuts, and edible plants. He hunted small animals when possible and occasionally slaughtered cattle belonging to local farmers, an act that reinforced tension between himself and the island's residents. Rice and salt were taken during brief raids on storage areas at night. Each action was planned to minimize exposure and preserve supplies. Weapons maintenance remained central to his routine. His rifle was cleaned regularly, protected from moisture, and kept operational long after it should have deteriorated. Ammunition was conserved. Shots were fired rarely and only with purpose. Blades and tools were sharpened using stones found in the forest. Clothing was repaired repeatedly, patched and repatched until it barely resembled its original form. Fire was used sparingly. When needed, it was concealed and extinguished carefully to avoid smoke or lingering heat signatures that could reveal his position. Cooking was done at irregular intervals and often at night. Smoke dispersal was considered before lighting even a small flame. Onoda marked time through natural cycles rather than calendars. The rhythm of monsoon seasons, dry spells, and harvest periods replaced dates. He observed changes in vegetation and animal behavior to anticipate weather. These patterns became his reference points, anchoring his sense of continuity. Mental discipline was treated as another survival tool. Onoda maintained military bearing even in isolation. He cleaned his uniform remnants, kept his equipment arranged methodically, and rehearsed scenarios of enemy engagement. He reviewed his orders repeatedly, not as a source of motivation, but as a stabilizing structure. The mission provided coherence to an otherwise narrowing world. Contact with the outside population was infrequent but consequential. When villagers entered the forest, Onoda observed them from a distance. He interpreted their movements through a wartime lens, viewing routine agricultural activity as potential reconnaissance. Any approach was assessed as a possible threat. Over the years, several encounters resulted in violence, leading to injuries and deaths among local residents. These incidents were documented by Philippine authorities and further complicated efforts to locate and persuade him. Search parties were sent periodically. Loudspeakers broadcast messages stating that the war was over. Letters from family members were delivered. Newspapers were left in clearings. Onoda examined these materials carefully. He noted that they lacked direct confirmation from his commanding officer. Without that specific authority, the information remained unverified. The years continued to pass. In 1959, the Japanese government officially declared Onoda dead, based on the length of his absence and reports from Lubang. For Onoda, this declaration was unknown. His internal framework remained unchanged. By the late 1960s, Onoda was completely alone. His last remaining companion, Kozuka Kinshichi, was killed in 1972 during an encounter with local police while burning rice stores, an action they believed necessary to disrupt enemy logistics. After Kozuka's death, Onoda conducted burial rites according to military custom. He collected his companions' belongings and continued alone. Isolation altered his world in subtle ways. Without conversation, language became internal. Thoughts were structured around observation and procedure rather than reflection. Memory was maintained through repetition rather than narrative. The outside world existed as an abstract enemy force, undefined but persistent. Despite decades of exposure, illness, and limited nutrition, Onoda remained physically capable. His health fluctuated but did not collapse. This resilience was partly due to his cautious habits and partly to chance. Minor injuries were treated with improvised methods. Serious illness never fully incapacitated him. By the early 1970s, the landscape around him had changed. Agricultural expansion reached deeper into the island. Roads improved. Technology advanced elsewhere. These developments appeared to Onoda as signs of increased enemy activity rather than peacetime progress. The framework he relied on adapted to include these changes without questioning its foundation. For nearly 30 years, doctrine replaced context. Orders replaced evidence. Survival was not experienced as endurance but as compliance. Onoda's continued presence on Lubang was not driven by confusion alone, but by a system that had been designed to persist without reinforcement. After the death of Kozuka Kinshichi in October 1972, Hiro Onoda's existence narrowed. Further, for the first time since his arrival on Lubang Island, there was no one else to share watch rotations, no second set of observations to compare against his own. The routines remained, but they were now carried out in complete silence. The physical effects of long-term isolation became more apparent. Clothing, already worn thin, offered limited protection against rain and insects. Nutrition depended almost entirely on what could be gathered or taken without confrontation. Periods of weakness followed times of scarcity. Minor injuries healed slowly. Fatigue accumulated rather than resolving. Psychological pressure increased, not through fear, but through compression. Without external feedback, Onoda's interpretations looped inward. Each new sign of activity, helicopter sounds, cultivated fields, unfamiliar equipment, was incorporated into an existing framework rather than evaluated independently. The possibility that the war had truly ended was considered, but never accepted as operational truth. Efforts to reach him intensified. In 1972, Japanese authorities recovered Kozuka's body, confirming that Onoda was still alive. Renewed attempts were made to communicate. Search teams entered the forest more frequently. Messages were broadcast again, this time with greater specificity. Yet the essential condition remained unchanged: no order had been delivered by a recognized superior officer. Time lost its conventional markers. Years passed without ceremony. National events, technological shifts, and generational change occurred elsewhere without registering in Onoda's daily calculations. His reference point remained 1944. The world beyond Lubang had advanced nearly 3 decades, but for him, the interval was experienced as a continuous present. In early 1974, a Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki entered the island deliberately seeking Onoda. Their encounter was calm and direct. Suzuki did not attempt to persuade him with documents or arguments. He listened. Onoda explained his situation clearly and coherently, stating that he would surrender only if ordered by his former commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan and located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who had originally deployed Onoda to Lubang. Taniguchi, now a civilian bookseller, agreed to travel to the Philippines. When Taniguchi met Onoda in March 1974, the exchange was formal. The order relieving Onoda of his duties was read aloud. Its authority was immediately recognized. There was no visible hesitation. The condition that had governed Onoda's actions for nearly 3 decades was finally reversed. With that, the longest phase of his survival came to a close. On March 9, 1974, Hiro Onoda emerged from the forest on Lubang Island accompanied by Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. He wore a faded uniform, still carefully maintained despite its age. His rifle was functional. Ammunition and a ceremonial sword were carried with him. Each item was presented in accordance with military protocol. The surrender was conducted without spectacle. Philippine officials were present, along with representatives from the Japanese government. Onoda handed over his weapons calmly. There were no statements made about endurance or sacrifice. The process followed administrative necessity rather than ceremony. Onoda was formally pardoned by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos for actions committed during his years in hiding, acknowledging the unique circumstances under which they occurred. The legal closure allowed the event to conclude without further proceedings. When Onoda returned to Japan days later, the reception was controlled. Media attention was significant, but official responses were restrained. The country he returned to bore little resemblance to the one he had left. Economic recovery, cultural shifts, and generational change had reshaped daily life. These differences were evident immediately, but not emphasized publicly. Onoda himself did not frame his survival as an achievement. In later interviews, he described his actions as the result of obedience, rather than personal resolve. He acknowledged that he had followed orders exactly as he understood them. The length of his isolation was presented as a consequence, not a goal. The transition from jungle to modern society was gradual. Support was provided. Adjustments were made quietly. There were no declarations of victory or failure. The war had ended long before, but for Onoda, it concluded only when the command structure he trusted delivered its final instruction. Hiro Onoda's survival on Lubang Island occupies an unusual place in modern history. It was not shaped by accident alone, nor by a simple failure of communication. It emerged from a system that valued endurance, hierarchy, and obedience above adaptation. That system functioned as designed, even after its context disappeared. Onoda lived for nearly 3 decades inside a war that no longer existed, sustained by discipline rather than hope. His experience does not resolve easily into triumph or tragedy. It reflects the limits of instruction when separated from revision, and the consequences of certainty maintained without correction. The island absorbed his presence and released it without transformation. The forest returned to its patterns. The villages continued to change. History recorded the dates. What remained was a quiet example of how long a human life can persist inside an order, even when the world that gave it meaning has moved on.